Good afternoon to those of you joining from Europe, and good morning to those connecting from the US. Welcome to this webinar in which we will speak in depth on the topic of climate change. Climate change is, without doubt, one of the greatest risks and challenges facing humanity. It's precisely for that reason, for its relevance and impact across both current and future generations, that an understanding of its principles, the science that underpins it, and the key questions surrounding the topic raised in scientific, socioeconomic, and technical material, and even within political discussions, become of crucial importance. Without questions, a greater and better understanding on the part of societies as a whole, as much as of the causes of climate change, as of its effects and implications, will allow us to reach a better awareness at the moment of addressing the problem. This will also assist in searching for alternative methods to mitigate its effects and greater efficiency in implementing solutions. With the aim of providing useful information that contributes to a serious and rigorous debate on the topic, the Naturgy Foundation, together with the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid and in collaboration with Harvard University, today present the study Climate Change, Scientific Basis and Questions for Debate. A study that has drawn on 10 renowned international experts on the subject and which has been exceptionally well coordinated by Julio Lumbreras, professor at the Technical University of Madrid, and thus visiting scientists from Harvard University. To all of these people, many thanks for the outstanding contributors. I would like to express our sincere appreciation to the Harvard University Center for the Environmental for both the presentation of this study and the presence of Daniel Rack, professor and director of the above-mentioned Center for the Environment. In addition to producing the prologue for the study, Professor Rack has also kindly accepted to act as moderator in the upcoming debate, a debate in which each of the previously mentioned climate change experts and contributors to the study will take part. This debate will take place from 4 different places around the world, another clear indication of the importance and global nature of the challenge we are facing. Before handing over to Daniel and Julio in the US, I wanted to share with you all a message from Teresa Rivera, Vice President and Minister of Ecological Transition from the Spanish government. The Vice President will have liked to have participated in the debate today, but unfortunately, her many commitments and obligations prevented this from being possible. We listen.
Entender, analizar, discutir cómo poder llevar a la práctica con pleno éxito, aprovechando todas las oportunidades que ofrece la transición energética, la lucha contra el cambio climático.
The fight against climate change in our society requires a huge collective effort, starting with the analysis of people who from the academia, but also from their daily practice, live every day with this reflection and can contribute with previous experiences or recommendations according to various scenarios, models, or learnings, from the perspective that we live in a world where others have the same experiences and demands. And this is what this book does. It contains 3-4 very important messages regarding the Spanish case. Firstly, it is a cross-cutting transformation that encompasses everything. Energy, but not just energy. Economy as a whole, industrial production, spatial planning, taxation, our capability to create more sustainable cities, a financial sector that needs to think risk and opportunity differently, and have turnkey instruments that facilitate individual decisions, together with the regulatory signals that governments offer us. I think this is a capital aspect about our analysis, and there is no doubt about it. Secondly, the external dimension in the transformation that the fight against climate change offers in our domestic policies. We shouldn't forget what it means to live in an interconnected world. the impact of climate change outside our borders will end up having consequences within our borders through shared transmission vectors, industrial production in third countries, famines, or problems of extreme weather events. The need for revolutionary change in the industry, which will also affect national production. This forces us to think together how we should all cooperate. Much more effective multilateral, regional, and neighborhood cooperation is needed. The third question that I think it's also essential. Imagine how to act in the short term without compounding the challenges that we will face in the medium and long term. Instead, we should reduce that difficulty. Consistency in the short, medium, and long term is key. Some solutions are available today, others are not. But if we start to work on them, we will accelerate the rate of decarbonization and also the ability to build resilience against the impacts of climate change. Taking as an example how nature offers us protection spaces when we let it operate without introducing additional risks.
Once again, I'd like to thank all of the contributors to this document as much for the efforts in producing the document as for the participation in today's debate. And of course, I thank you all for joining us. I hope that the study, as much as the debate, will prove to be interesting for you. That's all from my side in Madrid. Professor Rack, I hand over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Villaseca, and I must first of all thank the Naturgy Foundation for all of their support for this event. I think most of all, Professor Julio Lumbreras, who we'll hear from in a minute, has really been the mastermind behind putting all of this together, and he deserves enormous credit for all of us gathering today. So we are here today to hear from really visionary leaders in thinking about climate change. And the problem of climate change is one that is unlike anything else that human society has ever faced. It is perhaps the most challenging problem that humans have ever faced in the entire history of the world for two very simple reasons. First of all, it's a collective action problem at a global scale. And what that means is that we're really truly all in this together. There are those countries like the US and many others that have used fossil fuels for their economic development for the last 150 years and contributed a lot to the greenhouse gases of the atmosphere. And there are countries that are still very, very poor and have contributed almost nothing to the greenhouse gas accumulation in the atmosphere. But what climate change means is that all of those countries will experience the impacts of a warming climate. And it's not just warmer temperatures, it's rising sea levels from melting ice sheets, it's changing patterns of storms, it's higher risks of fires, drought, extreme weather, threats to agriculture and food production, and many other impacts that together really form an existential threat to human society and well-being. But it's a collective action problem because no one country or even group of countries can solve the problem by themselves. This really requires a global commitment, unlike anything we've ever seen before. Even during World War II or World War I, when many of the nations of the world fought against each other, there were enemies. There was great cooperation among the Allies, but we were fighting against an enemy. Here, we have no obvious enemy except ourselves. And we have to combine together to actually create the political will and the technological change to move beyond fossil fuels and ultimately stop putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now, the basic science of climate change, we've actually known about for more than 100 years. In 1896, Svante Arrhenius, the first Swedish scientist to win a Nobel Prize, wrote a paper describing the basic physics of the greenhouse effect. And he actually predicted that if we doubled the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from burning so much coal, that the temperature would rise 4 or 5 degrees. He was wrong. We don't think it's going to rise quite so much from just a doubling of carbon dioxide, we hope. But given that he did it in 1896, he did a pretty good job. The basic physics of the greenhouse effect was laid out then, and the same basic science is true today. But we've learned a lot in almost 125 years. We have many observations now. We know that climate change is not just something in the distant future, it's actually affecting us now. We are seeing sea level rise today at a rate of about 3.5 millimeters a year, but we see profound changes in the Greenland ice sheet and in the Antarctic ice sheet that spell terrifying changes ahead, threatening future generations. But this really leads to the other part of climate change that makes it such a difficult problem, which is the very long timescales. Just about every aspect of climate change involves long timescales, whether we're talking about the timescale for the oceans to absorb heat, which is centuries to millennia, or the timescale for ice sheets to melt or slide into the ocean, which we hope is centuries or hopefully many millennia, but may actually be quicker than that. All of these timescales, but perhaps one most of all, which is the timescale of the carbon cycle itself. The carbon dioxide we put in the air from burning fossil fuel, a substantial fraction of it will still be there for thousands of years. What that means is we are making decisions today that will affect the Earth, not just for our children and our grandchildren, but literally for thousands of generations of humans to come. And that is an awesome responsibility. And so in the face of that, we are trying to create the technological changes that will ultimately minimize our risks and try to protect future generations from the impacts we anticipate. There's plenty of uncertainty in the climate discussion, but it's not uncertainty about whether climate change is happening. It's about exactly what kind of risks are there and just how bad they are. We don't know exactly how much sea level is going to rise over the next century or two. We don't know exactly how strong the heat waves will be in 100 years or in even 20 years. We don't know how the hydrologic cycle will change or how difficult it will be to grow food through agriculture and how much adaptation will be needed. Most of all, we don't know how people will respond to these changes. Will they relocate with massive migration leading to all sorts of potential for conflict? Or will we develop new technologies that allow us to adapt to these changes? The answer is we don't know. As part of this effort, Professor Lumbreras has brought together world-leading experts to provide insights into many aspects of this problem. And I think that this is just a fundamentally noble undertaking. As scientists, I see our fundamental obligation is to tell the story of climate change, to communicate our understanding and also our uncertainty about this problem again and again and again, because it is our obligation to make sure that the rest of the world understands the risks and is prepared for what lies ahead. And so in that spirit, I look forward to hearing these different perspectives today and listening to their dialogue with each other. And I now turn it over to Professor Julio Lumbreras with great thanks for really making all of this happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Strack, and thank you for your leadership today and for all the support during this process as well. So, and thank you, of course, Naturgy Foundation to provide us the opportunity to write this book. So I'm sharing the screen now to present a bit the book. So let me share the screen now. Okay. So when Foundation Naturgy called me to write a book about the scientific basis of climate change, I thought, there's hundreds of books around this topic. How could I add any new insights? I know increasing public awareness is an essential element to react in time to solve this challenge. But how could I do that? Of course, I could have never done it alone. As climate change can be solved without an interdisciplinary approach, without a massive citizens' engagement, and without a commitment, as Professor Strack just mentioned, this book couldn't be written by one person. So then I proposed the foundation to write a collective book, and they agreed. Thank you for your understanding, Rafael, and thank you for supporting this. So when I got the green light, I thought about some of the remaining questions on the issue to try to face them in the book. And these are the main questions that I think they are still remaining. Is the greenhouse effect becoming stronger? And are we already suffering its effects? And is the only problem climate change, or is there other problems? And what's the anthropogenic contribution to climate change and to transgressing other planetary boundaries, other problems? And also Professor Strack talked about uncertainty. What are the major uncertainties, in particular in measuring and predicting? And we normally talk about mitigation, but can we and should we also adapt to climate change? Or shall we just focus on mitigation? And there's lots of new technologies to mitigate massively in the scale that it's necessary. And one is CO2 capture and storage. So is this technology needed? And finally, we tend to be very technocentric and think only about technology, but do we need a new socioeconomic model? Should we transform our socioeconomic model? So these are tough questions. And of course, I can't answer either. So I thought about the main experts worldwide that could reflect on them. I came back to the foundation with the list of experts. And of course, they agreed on having them on board. Now the problem started. How could I convince those guys to collaborate in the book? My great surprise came when all but two agreed. And you can see them here, and you will have today the opportunity to hear from them. And from the two that didn't have time to write a chapter, one suggested another colleague. I won't say the name of that person who declined. Anyway, they agreed. And now we have this fascinating book with internationally renowned experts that answers some of the remaining questions. But before learning from them with the great support from Professor Strack, and thank you again, I would want to introduce two ideas that are relevant to frame their interventions. First is who can talk about the scientific basis and what are the main uncertainties around climate change. So the first question, who can talk about this? And you probably know that the scientific basis of climate change are regularly compiled by the so-called IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the main international body for the assessment of climate change. The IPCC is the most rigorous scientific organization in the field of climate change. And moreover, its work is scrutinized by reviewers and governmental organizations from over 190 countries. It was created by the United Nations Environment Programme and the World Meteorological Organization in 1988 to provide a scientific overview of the state of knowledge on climate change at the time, as well as its potential environmental and socioeconomic impact. Since its inception, the IPCC has prepared 5 assessment reports, and the 6th, the so-called AR6, is due to be published in 2021. Today in this panel, we'll have some of the main people and the main authors of these assessment reports, and some were even vice chairs of some of the working groups. And these reports undergo a multi-stage drafting and review process to ensure a comprehensive and objective outcome. And they are produced in an open and transparent manner. Thousands of experts contribute as reviewers to ensure that all the views of scientific community are reflected. So it's a massive collective effort as well. And via careful supervision mechanism, various teams of editors and reviewers ensure that all the comments made during the review process are taken into account. So as you can imagine, it's a very hard and comprehensive process. And due to its very nature, the IPCC aims to include the scientific results of all research groups at the global level, considering both work that demonstrates anthropogenic influences on the climate and also that which rejects this hypothesis, provided they are scientifically validated, of course. So they include all the opinions and scientific basis from around the globe. The experts who contribute to the IPCC reports evaluate all scientific research and reflect the findings with greater or lesser importance in the reports depending on their relevance. Therefore, we cannot say that there are groups of scientists outside the IPCC, since all of their work is reflected in its reports. In fact, the certainty of the claims made in the IPCC reports depends on the degree of consensus on the different scientific contributions. So we have this IPCC, who's the main body, international body, to talk and assess climate change. And second question, what is certain? As Professor Strack just mentioned, there is plenty of uncertainty around climate change. But according to the latest report by the IPCC, the warming of the Earth's climate system is unquestionable. And probably Professor Moreno will talk about this in some minutes. And even more, since the 50s, many of the observed changes have been unprecedented over periods ranging from decades to millennia. You can see here a graph of the evolution of the CO2 concentration in the globe since 800,000 years ago, how this concentration has increased in the last years. So the atmosphere and oceans have warmed, and the volumes of snow and ice on Earth have decreased, and the sea level has risen. That's certain. Where there is more uncertainty is on the magnitude and type of action needed. This is illustrated by the famous debate between Professors Nordhaus and Stern here in the US, which shows the lack of agreement between two scientists of recognized prestige on the most effective measures to mitigate climate change. The origin of the discrepancies was related with the role of the discount rate in climate models, the technical progress of mitigation costs, and climate sensitivity. I won't go into the details, but you can imagine. So two great professors were discussing about this because there is no certainty in what to do and how to do that. Also in this domain, there are contrary and minority positions as those adopted, for example, by the famous Professor Lomborg and his Copenhagen Consensus Center, which considers many of the policies aimed at limiting climate change to be mistaken. However, according to recent analysis, the targets of the Paris Agreement on reducing greenhouse gas emissions are still technically achievable and economically favorable. So they are not only good for the environment, but they are good for our societies and is the smartest thing to do. In addition, the co-benefits associated to a decarbonized future advocate for decided action despite current uncertainties. So summarizing, we need to act and we have a roadmap, the Paris Agreement, that is feasible and smart because it generates direct economic savings and a lot of co-benefits like air quality improvements, creation of jobs, and additional health benefits, which are extremely relevant even more in this pandemic situation. And before giving the floor back to Professor Schrack, I would want to present on behalf of Professor Gerten the main aspects of his chapter, because he's not able to join us because he will be traveling with bad connection and he wasn't able to be with us today. And in his chapter, he was talking about other environmental problems and what are the interactions with climate change. So he was asking this question: what is the anthropogenic contribution to climate change and to transgressing other planetary boundaries? He mainly says that although climate change is perhaps the most daunting risk that humanity faces, it is only one of the 9 planetary boundaries that are considered to be critical for human life on Earth. These boundaries refer to perturbations in 9 environmental processes that together regulate the functioning and stability of the planetary system. And these are: first, depletion of the stratospheric ozone layer. You probably are very aware of this. Second, loss of integrity of the biosphere. Third, chemical pollution in the Earth system. Fourth, acidification of oceans. 5, disruption of the global hydrological cycle. 6, changes in land use. 7, interference in nutrient fluxes, mainly nitrogen and phosphorus. And 8, atmospheric aerosol loading, of course, on top of the 9th planetary boundary, which is the climate change. Professor Gerten also states in his chapter that the main cause of overstepping these planetary boundaries is agriculture, and in particular, industrialized resource-intensive agriculture, as you can see in the graph. You can see that the main problems are caused by this area dotted with black dots. So our planetary system is highly interrelated and complex, which means we need to develop holistic knowledge, as well as to understand its dynamic better. Specifically, we need knowledge of the interrelation of the climate system with the terrestrial biosphere, the water cycle, the oceans, and ice masses through the many processes and instances of feedback that can amplify climate change, as also Professor Schrack mentioned in the foreword of the book. So thank you again, all the authors, for this collective effort, an example of the collective action needed to tackle climate change. And for this action to face and combat climate change, we also need you attendees. We are more than 400 people today now. So thank you also you for spending this 90 minutes with us, and hope you enjoy the rest of the session. Thank you. So now give the floor back to Professor Schrack.
Thank you, Professor Lumbreras. Great. Thank you for that framing. And it's now my pleasure to introduce in order each of the authors of the of the chapters who will speak to you for 5 minutes, just giving a brief overview, and then we're going to have an opportunity to have a conversation with all of them. First, it's my pleasure to introduce Jose Manuel Moreno. Professor Moreno is a professor of ecology at the University of Castilla-La Mancha. He is a member of the author team of AR5 of the IPCC and the former vice chair of Working Group 2. Professor Moreno, please.
You have to unmute, Jose Manuel.
Now?
Yes,
okay,
perfect.
There we go. I was saying thank you very much, Dan, and thank you very much also, Julio, for all the work you did to put together this important book. The day before yesterday, the CO2 concentration at the World Reference Observatory in Mauna Loa, Hawaii, was 411 parts per million. This year, we reached a maximum of 417 ppm just before the spring in the Northern Hemisphere, and least the photosynthesis of the forest in this part of the world. From then until now, photosynthesis has thrived, and the concentration was driven down to 400 ppm, as I said. Now the leaves are starting to fall. The respiratory processes will dominate, and CO2 will most likely start increasing again until probably 420 ppm next spring. This change is what has been known as the heartbeat of the planet, which is repeated year after year. But unlike in the last hundreds of thousands of years, CO2 concentration now is not stable these days. When I was born in the early 50s, CO2 concentration did not reach 315 ppm. When my daughters were born in the late 80s and early 90s, CO2 concentration was 350 ppm, 35 increase in 4 years. In the last 30 years, we have doubled this rate of increase. So this is how things are going. Carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere because we burn fossil fuels. And as we expel it, part of it is absorbed by the plants or by the ocean. But they cannot take up everything. So it accumulates in the atmosphere and it increases the concentration. Since it is a powerful greenhouse gas, temperature increases. Today, we are 1 degree above pre-industrial temperature. Keep in mind that the average temperature of the world before we started to warm was a little bit below 15 degrees, so that you have an idea what 1 degree means. Not only temperature is on the rise, sea level is also on the rise due to the melting of ground-based glacial and polar ice. But it's not only that sea level rise is increasing, it's increasing at an accelerating rate. For instance, in the 90s, sea level was rising at about 3 millimeters per year. In the first 15 years of this century, it was at a rate of 4 millimeters per year. In the last 5 years, it is at 5 millimeters per year. So going to the question that it was posed at the beginning, yes, climate change is accelerating. But more so, extreme weather events are also on the rise. Not only they are becoming more extreme, but they are already becoming more frequent and more extreme. And more so, many, probably over 2/3 of the extreme events that are occurring, we have found out now that in part are being caused by climate change. In other words, it is climate change what is made them to be the way they are being. When we speak about this climate and weather extreme, we are referring to torrential rains, heat waves, or indirectly to the large forest fires that have been affecting now many parts of the world during this year. If climate changes, the organisms are on the rise. I have included in the book an example which I think is very interesting. In 1802, Alexander von Humboldt, he climbed the El Chimborazo volcano in Ecuador. He was very meticulous and drew up a very precise map of where the glaciers were, where the vegetation was, etc. 200 years later, other scientists climbed up the volcano, and they could observe the change that had happened. By comparing the map that von Humboldt drew, they could see that the glaciers have gone up, that some of the vegetation has gone up, and many other changes have occurred. It's probably not the best example that we have that organism and physical systems are on the rise, but it's one that I like because we can see it through our eyes and through the drawing of how things were 200 years ago by this eminent naturalist, Alexander von Humboldt. There are also many other examples, but obviously I cannot go to all of them. But let me just say to finish that organisms are moving to places where they can no longer be. If these organisms, they could cry out loud and make noise for the fact that they have to abandon the places that they would like to be on, the world today will be a big roaring noise. It will be a deafening noise. And I use this metaphor to conclude that, yes, we are changing the entire planet due to our action, that the evidence of it is overwhelming, and that we do not need any additional evidence to act. And no, this is no fake news, as those interested try to distract us with their devil's roars disguised as mermaid chants. Thank you.
You're muted, Dan.
Thank you so much, Jose Manuel. It's, look forward to being able to explore those examples in more detail in a little bit. Next on our program, we have Professor Rafael Borge. Professor Borge is a professor in the Department of Chemical and Environmental Engineering at UPM and visiting scientist at the Harvard School of Public Health. His scientific activity over the last 2 decades has focused on atmospheric modeling. Professor Borge.
Thank you, Professor Frack. Thank you, and hello, everyone. So the question for me was a rather tough one, and it's about the uncertainties. And what are the main uncertainties regarding climate change? So as Professor Frack mentioned in his introduction, the difficulty is extremely difficult to deal with uncertainties when we are discussing climate change, pretty much because of the timescales. So we are dealing here with phenomena that range from decades to millennia. So it's very difficult. On the one hand side, as for observations, we only have observations since relatively recent period. So our observational data set is limited. And then when it comes to the future, the only window that we have to look into to understand how future climate might be is using models, and so we have 2 uncertainties. So what we are doing, as we explain in the book, some of those uncertainties is impossible to remove them completely. So we have to live with uncertainty, with a certain degree of uncertainty. So what we are doing now as a community is to try to combine both evidence and agreement. So for instance, when we are talking about observations, it's impossible to just look at, for instance, temperature and see on a state that because temperature is rising, the whole climate system is changing. But you have many different observational data sets that are completely independent, and all of them are pointing in the same direction, maybe with slight variations on intensity, but they are pointing to the same direction. You can see that there is an unequivocal evidence that particular parameter is changing. And even more when that parameter is related with others, like, I don't know, like it's been mentioned, the sea rise or how ice volume in Earth is shrinking. So all that is confirming, you might not have the detail, but it's confirming that we are moving into that direction. The problem here is that small changes or uncertainties are relatively small, but small changes might produce huge differences concerning the outcomes of climatic change. And for that, we need to try to figure out what we can do. And models is our only tool here. So what we are doing, again, is trying, there is no perfect model, and those are very complex mathematical models that are sensu stricto, they are impossible to validate. But what we can do is to combine a number of different modeling techniques and different types of model, or even the same models we can use, we can repeat many simulations with small perturbation in input data. So we can understand what is the direction and what are the main messages that the model simulation are providing. And by combining all those models in what we call intercomparison exercises, we produce ensembles, and with that we can understand what is the most likely situation if we usually we try to study policy and scientifically relevant scenarios. And with that, we can be pretty sure of what's going to happen or what is the best way of action. But I also like to say that it's very important to try to assess as much as possible uncertainty in terms of scientifically for each of the features of the climatic system. But I think we need to consider uncertainty under a wider vision. So I would like to bring the attention that something has been mentioned already, that we need to understand what are the eco-benefits or tackling climate change, because we will see better air quality, and that means less burden of disease. We will see less and less severe extreme weather events. We will see that food security is increased. So if we look at the co-benefits, we really understand that there is no risk of overshooting. So we can we might not have the details and very certainty about. We can be very certain about what will be the specific outcome. It will be 4.5 degrees. It will be only 4.3. We cannot know that. But the evidence is supporting, if we look under this wider vision, that there is a clear evidence to support this decided climate action. And I think that the uncertainty or limited knowledge of the climatic system cannot stop us from acting now, because what we are doing in the next few years will be very relevant in terms of what will be the long-term outcome of this climate change. And that will be my message. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rafael. I look forward to thinking about that a little bit more. I think we can all agree, though, that whatever temperature we do manage to limit global warming to, it will not be enough. That is, there is no amount of work we can do that is too much. We need to do everything we can, and whatever we do will probably not be enough, which actually is a nice segue into the next speaker, who's going to talk about the issue of adaptation. Asuncion Lara St. Clair, she's a member of the European Commission Mission Board on Climate Change Adaptation and senior advisor to the Barcelona Supercomputing Center. And this question now of the climate change that we will experience regardless of what we do with the energy system now is a very important question, because societies all over the world are faced with unprecedented changes in their environment. And the question is, what will they do about it? Let me turn it over to Asuncion Lara, please.
Thank you very much, colleagues. And without a doubt, we need to adapt to climate change. And what I want to sort of put forward to discussion in this table today is some thinking about what does it really mean to adapt to climate change. My first point is that I believe it's very useful to think about adaptation about a change process. So playing with the words, what we need is to focus on the change and our adaptability to change. And this means that adaptation to climate change is difficult to decouple to other socioeconomic, technical, or cultural transformation processes that are already happening in our societies all over the world. And of course, this doesn't mean that we need to be distracted from mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. On the contrary, I believe that quite a lot of very good research shows that we need both perspectives embedded in transformation processes and at multiple scales, global and local scales. So perhaps the most important adaptation we need is actually to change the way in which we perceive risk, to change our behavior, our way of doing business, to consume our financial systems towards mitigating climate change rather than continue business as usual. However, what is important, I believe, and quite a lot of research has shown that, is that these change processes can lead to positive and negative consequences. It can be very different impacts once the change process is in place to different sectors of societies and even to different parts of the world. We are not all in the same situation at the same time. So my second point is that to ensure that these change processes are effective and fair, we really need to pay very central attention to social and human dimensions. In the IPCC work that we did in the 5th assessment report, and that is continuing in the 6th assessment report, adaptation was framed around the language of risk. It was a question of risk management. And this is very important. It's very important because it enables us to raise awareness on how to integrate climate risk alongside other risks. So for example, any business in the world has a risk management plan. So it makes a lot of sense to talk the language of risk in order to integrate those risks. But it also has led, I believe, to narrowing the problem of adaptation too narrowly and to focus perhaps on hazards and losses or even in technological responses. So for example, to protect a town from sea level rise is all about building dikes, whereas we have learned quite a lot that other options like nature-based solutions that also include the role that people have in those natural environments can be much more effective and produce better results. So I believe we need to attend to the social heart of adaptation to climate change, and this will lead us to framing the problems and the solutions in a very different direction, attending to social issues, to people, to psychological dimensions, to the role of cultural factors in uptake of solutions, and also, very importantly, on the key role of values and beliefs in changing how we live, how we consume, or how we face risk. And this leads me to a topic that my previous speaker has already mentioned and very importantly reflects the recent research on adaptation to climate change. That is that we need somehow to ensure that we make transparent the winner and the losers of adaptive solutions. So if climate change is human-made, the solutions are also human-made. So there is also a co-benefit in making sure we don't forget that social heart. So what we need, I believe, is adaptation that is synergetic and transformative. Synergetic in the sense of generating co-benefits, but also synergetic in transforming the way in which we integrate and adapt to climate change with other socioeconomic needs, in making the world better, not only in seeking the co-benefits of less pollution, but also in creating adaptation strategies that at the same time address, let's say, existing needs, basic needs and demands. And also to make sure that we sort of seek for change that is non-linear, that can create rapid transformation because we don't really have a lot of time. So this adaptive response to climate as a transformative change opens up a range of novel options. And this is extremely important in the context of developing countries and in the context of existing cases where there is already serious deficit in the access of basic needs, when there are situations of conflict, when there are situations of multiple forms of discrimination. So in short, what we need is evidently, yes, we need to adapt to climate change, but we need to do so in a way that is very aware of the social dimensions and the human dimensions, and design strategies amongst all that generate co-benefits and that prevent harm to people. So this is what I wanted to say, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Dan, you're muted, sorry.
Thank you so much. It's such an important area to think about, and truly the lives of hundreds of millions of people depend on how we answer those questions. So we'll look forward to exploring that more in a few minutes. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Kirsten Dunlop. She is the Chief Executive Officer of EIT Climate KIC, Europe's largest public-private partnership focused on innovation to address the climate emergency. Kirsten has worked in academia, in consulting, banking, insurance, strategy, innovation, and leadership. And we've been hearing about the idea that that green development and the energy transformation can lead to economic prosperity. And I'm excited to hear from Kirsten about that.
Thank you very much, Dan. Can I just check that you can hear me okay? All good?
Yes, we can hear you.
So I think let me introduce then an element that is within this book of how. And I would particularly wish to build on the call for a focus on the social heart of adaptation to climate kikfumanthuntheon and the key role of values and beliefs in how we face risk and change. I'm speaking from the perspective of being in charge of an organization whose role is to bring innovation to the problem of both decarbonization and adaptation. And at the heart of that enterprise to observe, as I do so and as we do so, what are we bringing? What is the design of innovation itself and the design of the way in which we address the problems of climate change? And what is it that we are ultimately innovating? What is it that we are addressing as we seek to change ourselves and to solve or to halt the rather horribly inexorable forces of planetary change that we see around us? There are three things that I would wish particularly to draw out. And they are very much about a question of how do we need to act? What is it that we need to change in the way in which we are addressing this problem? There are 3 points in particular, and I'll unpack them quickly. First is the question of the instruments we are using and the approaches we are using. We are seeking to solve something that is the most systemic, most complex problem we have faced as a species that we barely begin to comprehend, for which we have tools for thinking to name some of its dimensions with the language of complexity, with notions of system dynamics, with the beginnings or the extent of understanding that we can bring to the structural uncertainty and non-linearity of complex dynamics. But we do not have a set of established practices and ways of dealing with that with the nature, the domains of that kind of order of problem that are fit for purpose. We have been addressing climate change with tools that are constructed in, with, and for the world of mechanistic, managed, project-based, linear thinking, rational thinking that has taught us about optimization, that tells us that efficiency and effectiveness is the way forward, and looking for and drawing upon the economic rationalist models that we have constructed our economies and our lives along. And that means that we are continually caught in a mismatch between the nature of the problem and the types of the tools and the types of tools and instruments that we are using. If I come to where that shows up in innovation, we have been running models of innovation all over the world, privileging the sourcing of solutions, tending to type back into the fact that solutions are born within the domains that pay for them, or born within the domains that look for a relatively comfortable quick fix to a problem, and that therefore tend to emerge as single point solutions that tend to be funded as individual bankable projects and tend to be scaled as bankable assets, all remaining within a set of categories that are unhelpfully not designed for complex, unpredictable, non-linear, unmanageable, and kind of unprogram manageable changes at the scale that we need. So we need a way of doing innovation that is designed for purpose, that is literally fit for purpose. And we need to think about both the order, the nature of complexity itself, and the scale at which we would need to operate. I think I would particularly wish to call out the design of innovation in such a way as to accommodate and prepare for uncertainty, thinking about recasting innovation as something that has a deliberate role to play in the face of uncertainty, because it is a mode of exploration, of learning, of de-risking by connecting constantly context and possibility. And it is a way of mobilizing participation, which in itself engages that question of values and beliefs in terms of what we understand around the possibility of change and how in which we might adopt it. And if innovation is shifted away from kind of the accelerator-led, funnel-led criteria selection, let's try to find winning solutions, and is embedded in the social and political complexity of change, then innovation is also a mechanism by which we can generate options. We need options for decision makers to consider alternatives in such a way that there is a direct connection between the real economy of transformation needs, the real social economy of crisis and the need for resilience, and the possibility of unexpected combinations that open up something different in the way in which we're thinking. If I come then, and there are obviously a number of mechanisms by which that can be done, and that's, I won't go into those, they are some of the world of what an organization like Climate Kick is practically experimenting with. How do you redesign the entire innovation approach and effort to make it possible to work with inherent complexity and uncertainty and deliver options and choices to decision makers in time? The second element I wanted to raise has to do with root causes. One of the challenges is that we continue to privilege solutions that are substitutional, rather than going to the heart of the problem and changing the nature of demand itself, of reframing what it is that we are asking for, and as a result of that, what we're getting. I would particularly wish to call out, I know this is a meme, it shows up over and over again. If I think of all of the places where I talk and engage, the constant thread around we need to get rid of GDP, but underpinning that is a neoclassical economic, a set of neoclassical economic ideas and neoliberal economics that no matter where we sit, continue to underpin. And the problem is not so much the models, but the extent to which we have normalized them, as if they were a neutral, universal force, rather than the result of design and choice and agency. And therefore something that we can change if we wish to accept and embrace that those are the results of choice. We work in cities, for example. One of the biggest problems in cities is that when you run the economics, it costs more to plant a tree than it costs to build a building, which is not one of those visible economic metrics close to hand, but it is running like a deep underground river underneath so much of the planning choices, the risk management choices, the procurement choices, the community design choices, and surfacing that and pulling it up into the surface of the light to say, why is that there? And tracing back its root causes that have to do with a whole set of economic measures that are privileging risk management, cost optimization, efficiency, effectiveness, and so on. So here, I think there's a question, a design question, designing for resilience or achieving resilience, adaptation, decarbonization by design and not by disaster. We need to go back to our root causes, and we need to think, how do we institutionalize hope and care as our root design principles for everything else that we build on top of it, in terms of economic flows, in terms of stocks, in terms of assets, in the ways in which we think about human society. That's going to require us to rethink governance, because the economics of scale are the economics that dominate our world. We need to think about the fact that humans form social systems and cooperate most effectively at small scales. So governance, polycentric governance, if we bring Elinor Ostrom's thesis back into play, that allow us to work more effectively at a managed cultural evolution of smaller scales and cooperate amongst communities that can then follow the lines, the natural lines of river basins, of orchards, of fields, of farms, of value chains that are within reach and therefore within meaning. And that brings me to the third point. we are continuing, and I speak from the heart of the practice of active, hopeful, optimistic change and work on solutions. We are continuing to deal with climate change as an exogenous and not an endogenous problem, something that is out there that needs to be fixed, with cows that produce less methane, with fields that produce less chemicals, with cars that produce less emissions. We are continuing to stand away or to fail to embrace the core problem of identity, of human identity as being intrinsically part of, within, and independent on a context. And I think for me, one of the biggest structural issues that I face as an innovator and that is embedded in this call for action is the extent to which we separated art and science as a function of productivity and the Industrial Revolution, and in fact, a little bit away further back. And in doing so, we managed to separate the constant field of inquiry of who are we, on what do we depend, and what do our choices produce. And that means that we have lost touch with the fact that human systems and human societies change through meaning. They change by creating. They are created and structured by meaning. They change through narratives and structured social conversations over time that are carried by narratives. We have constructed societies on that basis, binding and weaving together the relationship between our choices, their outcomes, and their implications. And in some odd way, in this technocratic-driven STEM approach to addressing climate change, we've lost the narratives for how we start by changing ourselves in order to change the way in which ourselves are impacting the world around us, and therefore going back to the root causes of demand. And that needs to become a design principle that is embedded in the heart of the way in which we unlock, unleash, and address the technical, social, and economic practice of innovation to design for resilience and survival. Thank you.
Kirsten, thank you. There's a lot in what you just said, and I wish we had hours to unpack it all. But I do need to move to the last two speakers who combined to work on the final chapter, which is really about the energy system and the process of decarbonization, specifically about carbon dioxide capture. And that's my colleagues at MIT, Howard Herzog and Ruben Juanes. I believe Howard Herzog is going to go first. He's a senior research engineer at the MIT Energy Initiative, and he's been working on carbon capture and storage technologies for over 30 years. Let me introduce Ruben at the same time, because they will be seamless in this. Ruben is a professor in civil and environmental engineering and a professor in earth and atmospheric and planetary sciences at MIT. And he is a graduate from the University of A Coruña in Galicia, and he got his MS and PhD degrees from the University of California at Berkeley, as did I. He has published extensively in the areas of induced seismicity and carbon capture and storage. Howard, Ruben, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan. So I'm going to address the question of is CO2 capture needed. There are some who say that by decarbonizing the electricity sector and electrifying everything else, we can reach net zero emissions. However, that's way too simplistic. About 1/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions can be classified as very difficult to mitigate. These emissions will require innovative solutions, and this is where carbon capture can play a leading role. The traditional vision of carbon dioxide capture and storage, or CCS for short, is to capture CO2 generated by burning fossil fuels before it's released to the atmosphere, and then store it in geologic formations. Today, CCS projects are successfully capturing over 30 million tons of CO2 every year, but this is just the beginning. Industries like cement and steel account for about 10% of our CO2 emissions, but a significant portion of this CO2 comes from the process, not energy use. For example, limestone, the key ingredient in making cement, is the source of half the CO2 emissions by the cement industry. CCS is the only way to eliminate these emissions. Hydrogen, like electricity, is a carbon-free energy carrier. It can replace the critical role of natural gas in the power sector, provide high temperature heat for industry, and can power long distance road transport, as well as transport by rail or ships. The cheapest way to make clean hydrogen, that is without carbon dioxide, and this is by at least a factor of 2, is from reforming natural gas with carbon dioxide capture and storage. Finally, there are certain greenhouse gas emissions that are extremely challenging to eliminate, including emissions from aviation and from agriculture. Here, the best way to proceed may be to continue to emit, but offset those emissions. Offsets, also called negative emissions, are generated by removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Two of the most promising pathways require CCS. These are bioenergy with CCS and direct air capture. In summary, capturing CO2 from power plants and industrial facilities, by being the low-cost provider of carbon-free hydrogen, and by generating negative emissions, carbon capture has a major role to play on our journey to net zero emissions. And now, to answer the question of what to do with all that captured CO2, I turn it over to my colleague, Ruben Juanez.
Thank you, Howard, and thank you, Dan, for the introduction. I think it is very appropriate that the topic of geologic sequestration comes at the end of this series of short perspectives, because that is precisely the role that it plays in climate change mitigation. It is an enabling technology at the tail end of the pipe of all that captured CO2. So whether the captured CO2 comes from the flue gas stream of a power plant or from direct air capture, the question then arises, what to do with it? And some opportunities exist for using it as a feedstock, perhaps for the growth of algae or for cement manufacturing. But these opportunities are very limited in the amount and the rate at which they can be economically deployed, not sufficiently fast for the aggressive climate change mitigation that we all agree is needed. So therefore, most CO2 capture strategies call for long-term storage of CO2 in deep geologic formations. So the storage of CO2 in the subsurface is realized by means of injection wells to a depth of 1 to 3 kilometers, where the CO2 is in so-called supercritical form. That means that it's compressed to a density that is similar to the density of a liquid. And in principle, one can think of different geologic environments that can hold the CO2 over millennia. One option is to inject the CO2 in depleted oil and gas reservoirs. This option could be attractive because the CO2 could be used to enhance oil recovery and in that way offset some of the costs. But ultimately, this option has limited capacity and geographic availability, as we know. Another option is for CO2 to be injected in deep saline aquifers. And these are permeable geologic formations, deeper than 1 kilometer, where the pore water salinity is much higher than seawater, so that it would never be used for as a source of drinking water. And indeed, research has shown over the past few decades that deep saline aquifers constitute the most promising option for large-scale CO2 storage, given that, one, they're widespread geographically, they offer potentially a huge storage capacity, and by proper site selection and monitoring, one can ensure that no leakage would occur. So I would like to close this summary by emphasizing the scale of the problem, at least from my perspective. So we can go back to what the number is for current anthropogenic emissions, and this would be on the order of 40 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year worldwide. So that's 40 billion, American billion, metric tons per year. So even if CCS were to accommodate just, say, 10% of those emissions, it would still be operating at a level of 4 gigatons of CO2 per year. So this is a number so large that it's really hard to digest or to visualize. So at a typical reservoir density of the CO2, of compressed CO2, that would amount to 140 million barrels. I'm going to hug a barrel here with my arms, right? So we all know what a barrel is. So 140 million barrels of compressed CO2 per day. So that is about twice the amount of oil that circulates through the globe daily. And this gives you a sense of what the scale is needed for the infrastructure of CCS. And we can then conclude that this is a phenomenal challenge and one that is shared by all climate change mitigation technologies, if we really want to make a dent in our current CO2 emissions. So with that, I will close saying that I look forward to the discussion, and thank you.
Thank you, Ruben. Thank you, Howard. We now have an opportunity to have a discussion with all of our distinguished speakers. And I want to really, there's so much to digest from all of you, but let's start a little bit on the climate side. I'd like to start in echoing some of the things that Asuncion and Lara talked about in the context of adaptation and thinking about risk, framing adaptation around risk. And when that comes to risk, it sometimes is not quite the way that scientists think about the climate problem. We study what we study, and we tend to like to talk about the things we know, and we don't necessarily talk about the things we don't know. And so this is really a question for any of the scientists here, but especially Jose Manuel and really Rafael as well. When you think about the areas of the IPCC or of your chapter that you've written for this book, what are the parts that represent serious risk to human society from climate impacts that are not receiving enough attention right now, that we don't hear enough about, maybe because the science is still highly uncertain? Jose Manuel, do you want to start?
Okay. Yeah, I'll discuss a little bit this idea of risk, because as I was in the fourth assessment, and then the fifth assessment was a big change. And in reality, even though Asuncion says, yeah, there are some problems, yes, but I think we were at the beginning a little bit lost with impacts. We really were not framing our understanding and the things we knew towards action. And I think in that regard, having a framework of risk is easier almost, I would say, for everyone to see, probably more the managers. It is true, as you are asking, Daniel, that we scientists normally, we have not framed our issues into that framework. And that means that progress, I think, is still slow. And I myself, I'm a person that works on risk, on fires. And I tell you, the community of fires, we are still doing as best as we can to try to accommodate to this new framework. We are not there yet. I mean, we continue with our own way because it worked, but reframing it, it's sluggish. As you say, we all stay where we find more comfortable with it, and that's where we are. So there is still, I think, a long way to become and together and use everyone the same metrics and the same approaches. So hopefully AR5, which is now almost there, will bring us some more progress into this. So as I said at the beginning, I think having a good framework is very important. And I go to what Kirsten was saying. If we don't have an appropriate framework, then simply we are buried with knowledge here and there, with ideas, etc. And there have been so much noise, and there have been so many difficulties to really try to bring things towards action in a clear way. I think the issues of framing and a clear framing, I think is really critical. And in this regard, for me, risk framing climate change impacts into risk, I think is very important.
So Rafael, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and I think it will be the next logical step. So we took a step forward about uncertainty and trying to understand what we know and what we don't know. And the next thing will be to try to frame better the concept of risks, because right now is there, because you have different scenarios and you see the outcomes. So you can, by comparing them, you can understand what are the risks that you are having by not acting or by not developing certain emission abatements. So that's, in a way, it's already there. But still, under this wider perspective, I think that there are interesting studies going on in terms of how to propagate uncertainties, and specifically taking into account what are the needs or your study or your application, for instance, developing infrastructures. There are some interesting methodologies to try to expand the uncertainty of model predictions to take that to the ground level, to see what are the risks that you are running, both financially or in terms of impact in your specific application. And I think that the next step forward will be to try to formalize that risk analysis and framework.
Thank you. I kind of wonder, I want to turn to you, Cynthia. Cynthia Lera, I feel like we typically we go from the science to the social science. And I kind of wonder if we actually need to turn that around. If, in fact, rather than the scientists talking about the risks, that then the social scientists and people who actually study the adaptation that people are required to do, then take those analyses. If it actually needs to be the other way around, if we actually need to look at what people are experiencing, especially as we see every year environmental refugees, not just in poor countries in the world, in places like the US, people along the Gulf Coast literally moving away from the storms that are threatening them. And there's going to be more and more of that every year. How do we think about that? And how do we get society to take that seriously?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because I think that is a lame excuse, but that brings often like is a different magnitude of complexity, like going in the other direction. But it's something that society is demanding, like for instance, in terms of insurance, like that kind of risk is really needed. So I think in this case, we need to, as we did with our simulations, we need to move forward, even understanding that our knowledge is not perfect, and understanding that we don't have the risk is. We need to consider seriously equity. That is something that it was brought up in other interventions. But globally, there is no risk of overshooting. So I think we can move from there. And even our knowledge is not perfect. Let's try to maximize the co-benefits. So we don't really need to have that formal framework that will be really, really difficult. I wouldn't know where to start. But that cannot prevent us from acting. That will be my view on that.
Kirsten, I just want to, you were talking about creating this atmosphere for innovation, creating the context, and it's a complex system, as you say. We tend to think about innovation in the context of energy technology. There's a great quote from H.G. Wells in his book, The Time Machine. He said, "We are kept keen on a grindstone of pain and necessity." That sounds a little bit cruel, but I think there's something wise in that. I kind of wonder if climate change and the impacts of climate change are going to push society to all sorts of innovation, not necessarily in energy technology, but in ways of actually managing the situation. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I would completely agree with you. And in fact, that's exactly what we are working on. I think for me, the essence of it is to think about what innovation is and what it is for. And for me, one of the key markers is innovation. If we wish it to be, or if we wish to acknowledge it, it's a transitive verb, not an intransitive verb. It is making a change in something, not simply producing the new for the new's sake. It's not invention. And I think the key here is the change that we need innovation to make. If you're a business trying to compete in a changing world, or a city trying to work out how to decarbonize by 2030, is a change in the self. If that's the departure point for innovation, then it sets up a possibility for constructing a framework for innovation to be pulled in towards that need. First of all, to define and to understand that need in systemic terms. And that would mean, for example, if I describe the work that we're doing, for example, in the city of Madrid, which is in parallel discussing that live as this session goes on. That's about understanding what is the city of Madrid going to need to address in all of its complexity in order to fully decarbonize by 2030 and prepare for crises of water, of heat, of migration, and of significant social tension. That defines a framework of need, defining that and understanding it in systemic terms and allowing for the fact that those are complex systems, all of them, because it's economic, it's financial, it's social, it's physical, it's procedural and policy and so on, and it's embedded within a multi-tiered legislative system, then allows you to set up a portfolio approach to innovation where you are explicitly creating a portfolio that seeks to place innovation in literally every aspect of what it is that is currently the formal and informal life of that city. And that's innovation in social behaviors, that's innovation in participatory governance, that's innovation in trees, water, waste infrastructure, in energy substitution, in the way in which we think about movement, and so on. So the approach that I'm describing is to reconfigure innovation in such a way that it simply isn't about one particular problem that we want to search X number of particular solutions, but it is a response to an end game of transformative differences in the way we live. And it becomes a designed and managed exercise in experiential learning. And I don't mean learning in a light touch way at all. I mean deep, powerful, practical applications in streets and cities, citizens choosing to trial different alternatives, combinations of, say, rewilding together with food security, with urban farming, together with the reconfiguration of natural materials into physical construction, together with wastewater treatment, say with microalgae, together with something that looks at the way in which energy can be distributed and owned. Take 15 different possibilities, put them together, put them in place simultaneously and connect them up. Then we start to have innovation used as a complex adaptive learning system to help us understand as quickly as we can, how do we catalyze phase shifts and transitions in behavior? How do we catalyze the equivalent of social and behavioral tipping points? How do we categorize the equivalent of phase transitions in planning and procurement and decision-making? Because we essentially need to work out what do we know of complexity theory and how do we plug that into human decision-making, technology development, capital management, capital allocation, and policy. And that's what I'm describing, something where we change the way we use the exercise of changing ourselves through human ingenuity, which is innovation.
That's a fascinating way to think about it. I actually chair the science board at the Santa Fe Institute, so I think a little bit about complex systems. So I'm curious about that. And I know Jose Manuel wants to jump in, but before we do that, I actually want to bring in Asuncion, and I want to hear her perspective on this, because this is so central to what you were talking about.
Thank you very much, Daniel and colleagues. So these are my thoughts. First of all, I think that the risk framing was useful. What I said is it's not enough. And let me tell you why I believe you are completely right, that we need to turn around and look at the problem or the solution from those that suffer it, right? Start looking at the people, understanding how people experience climate change, what are the problems that they face, and what are the existing solutions that they already have while living their lives and doing other things. And this also gives lessons to answering your other question, which is what are the most important risks? When you look at it from that perspective, from the bottom, the most important risks are the compound risk. It's one risk after the other. It's multiple things at the same time, because that's also another mistake, right? We tend to think, oh no, the most important thing is fires and so on. The danger is when people experience a heat wave and right after fires, or at the same time, and then at the same time or shortly after drought. And all this is what doesn't enable societies and people to be resilient and to respond. And I think huge risks emerge with that. At the same time, let me also say that we need both. We need also the top perspective from the science. And one area where this is very clear is in climate services, where we talk about co-production of climate services, which is translating climate information in a way that is salient and usable for people that then need to put to work that climate information for whatever decision that needs to be made. So it's neither nor, but yes, I think we need to make that shift also for the reasons that Kristen says, right? Because if we don't have time for all this to move slowly in a linear process, we need to find the leverage points that can make the big shift and the linear shift. And we need to be very careful that these big tipping points don't put us in another bad place, but rather in a good place, in the place of the co-benefits.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point you made just now about time, Asuncion, because time is of the essence. And the challenge is not just creating innovation, Kirsten, it's creating innovation in a highly compressed timescale. And in general, in most systems, when you try to accelerate things, you tend to sacrifice innovation. Economists tend to think about equilibrium thermodynamics, not kinetics. And the question we have now is, how do we accelerate innovation in a way that we've never done before? I want to bring in Howard and Ruben a little bit, because Ruben, you mentioned the incredible scale of what's required. That's not just for carbon capture and storage. That's true for any technology, whether we're talking about solar and wind or batteries, or whether we're talking about advances in transportation, new airplane transport systems based on hydrogen, any of those things. The scale of the world energy system and reimagining it is almost beyond belief. And yet, another way to look at it is that we built the one we have today. It's an existence proof that it's possible. We just have to do it again. Do you want to jump into this about thinking about innovation and technology in this context?
Yes, I would. I think that's a fantastic way of framing the daunting task that we have in front of us, to come to grip with what a gigaton means, and not only a gigaton, but a gigaton per year scale, what that means. And I would offer the following thought, and that is that we need innovative solutions at least two different timescales. One where we can afford blue sky thinking, completely rethink our energy systems, the way we operate as a society, where we all buy into something that is radically new and different from what we currently have. But that timescale may not be enough. And I personally feel that given the intrinsic inertia that energy systems have by their own scale, bridge solutions are also going to be needed. And this is why I am happy to advocate for solutions that are bridged to some yet to be determined energy future. And I believe that carbon capture and storage is one such solution that technologically it can be deployed rapidly today. I mean, today, within the next few years, at a timescale much more compressed than the yet to be determined energy future. So this is where I see an opportunity in innovation, in commitment at two different timescales, and I think both are needed if we are to really operate at the gigaton scale, at the billion metric ton scale per year.
Howard, you want to jump in here?
So, yeah, innovation is a very non-linear process. It's sometimes happenstance. Sometimes, two people get together and all of a sudden ideas come out. So it is hard to rush innovation, but what's really needed is to set the stage for innovation, to set the incentives, to set the goals, and that's important for the government to do. And unfortunately, here in the U.S., we haven't been doing a very good, job of getting that climate policy to really set the innovation. The other thing that's needed besides innovation, because of the scale of these things and because of the sunk capital and everything, is infrastructure. We're going to need all sorts of new infrastructure. If we're going to do carbon capture and storage, we're going to need infrastructure. Europe's talking very much about hydrogen. Well, if you're going to start having hydrogen as an energy carrier, you need infrastructure. Even with renewables, a lot of the renewables expansion is being held up because you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the transmission lines. We don't have even the right. Let's listen to another webinar this morning on, because they're intermittent electricity producers, our whole electricity system isn't really set up for them. And there's got to be a lot of things to happen to have a resilient electricity system. So I think government, I don't think is good at innovation, but what the government needs to do is both, set the markets that will provide incentives for innovation so that you can unleash the billions of people on this earth to do the innovation. And at the same time, governments are also going to have to come up with the money where there's good innovation, be able to get the infrastructure in place so those innovations can get to the scale that we're going to need to get them to.
Thank you. Unfortunately, Julio tells me that we're running out of time. I just want to, we have maybe 30 seconds or so. Is there anybody who, Jose Manuel, do you have a very quick final word for us?
You're muted, Jose Manuel.
You're muted, Jose Manuel.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on what you asked about what is the most important risk. And I would say the unexpected one. And the example of the COVID, it's really disastrous. I mean, there we are, we almost knew everything and yet total failure almost everywhere. And this is what concerns me. I mean, I think the science, and the more we go to the more physical, knows more, the biological more complicated than the social sciences. Yes, maybe we need to change the focus as you were asking, because that's where we are failing. And now it's time to action. We need to act, we need to do things. But almost anyone with a big loudspeaker now, all of a sudden can change the minds of many people and negate anything that we know that it's fully proven. So there, I think we have a problem. It's not so much in the more physical or biological areas. Probably it's more in the social sciences. How do we deal with this to use the science that we know it works? I mean, we are sure about it or very sure about it. So I think that's the major problem these days.
Wonderful.
May I make a 30-second?
Absolutely.
I was participating in something a couple of weeks ago, and it was with Dave Snowden, who was talking about the latest evolutions of the Cynefin framework, and he mentioned something. I was thinking, Howard, about your reflection on where you are. That if you're going to meet what is happening at the moment with COVID, with Trump, with Boris, and so on, you cannot meet that with the force of argument. We need attractors, modulators. We need shifts in the basins of attraction for people. And I think there's something in there about how do we bring the combined forces of the narratives of science, of the exercise of innovation, of the bold dreams that kind of give us backup plans, and the small changes that add up. But how do we do something that creates attractors of attention rather than arguments that are just falling into the sand? And I think there's something in what we collectively can do across almost every sphere of activity, from science, research, technology to innovation and social change, to try and work with an operating plan that understands we're not going to reason our way out of this. We're going to have to do it differently.
I think those are good words to end our session with. I have a few closing words just quickly. First of all, great thanks to Julio Lumbreras for being the mastermind for all of this. Thank you for bringing all of us together. I want to make sure people appreciate that this book is available for free in Spanish and English at the Naturgy Foundation website. And that is very important. There's so much more than what's been discussed today in this volume, and you can get it for free at the Naturgy website in English or Spanish. So please go there and look for it. I want to thank, of course, the Naturgy Foundation once again for making all of this possible. And finally, a thanks to the speakers, who were, I think, all wonderful in their insights. And finally, a thanks to you, the audience. Ultimately, you are the test of our efforts, taking our words and turning them into action. So thank you for joining us. And we look forward to having another opportunity to engage with you in the future. Thank you.
Crowds of people wait for me. Seagulls scavenge, seal ice cream. Worries vanish within my dream. Left my soul there.